Good afternoon and welcome back for this plenary session of the conference. I am Mark Poorman, Vice President for Student Affairs and a member of the Theology Department faculty here at Notre Dame, and it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker and to chair this session. Dr. Tristan Engelhardt is Professor of Philosophy at Rice University and Professor of Medicine, Community Medicine, Obstetrics and Gynecology, and Medical Ethics at Baylor College of Medicine, where he is also a member of the Center for Medical Ethics and Health Policy. He edits both the Journal of Medicine and Philosophy and Christian Bioethics, and he is co-editor of the book series Philosophy and Medicine, which now has about 60 volumes in print. Dr. Engelhardt is the author of over 250 articles, chapters of books, in addition to book reviews and other publications. He has co-edited more than 25 volumes and is author of 4 books, the latest of which I will be shamelessly hawking, is The Foundations of Christian Bioethics, published this fall. I must say, having been impressed and inspired by many presentations here at Notre Dame to the annual conference on medical ethics, I think I can say that of all of those distinctions that Tris has, the one that he claims most readily is that he is a proud citizen of the Republic of Texas. I know that we have benefited from his brilliant analyses of ethics cases and health policy issues, but a big bonus for us through the years has been our continuing education here in the history of Texas, the biographies of some of its more eccentric luminaries, and the anthropology of one of the most fascinating cultures in the world. However, Tris's presentation today is entitled After Christendom, the Moralization of Religion and the Culture of Death, in which he will explore the claim that Christianity is no longer the established source of our culture. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Tris Engelhardt.
I first want to thank Dr. Poorman for the excellent and lovely and generous introduction, and then I'd like to ask him to hand back my paper. Always have to watch administrators. They come there, they say, I'm going to be helpful to you, and then they walk off with your paper and leave you speechless. It is an honor and pleasure to be here. I thank you for your sojourn with me today as I explore a number of issues bearing on our culture. I will give you, in the spirit of informed consent, a little sense of where I'm coming from, picking up Alistair's remarks about the ambiguity of culture. Father Poorman already pointed out that not all of us belong to the same culture just because we are in North America or in the United States. If one gets to know Texans well, one gets to know that we are quite different from the others around, and our taken for granted moral sentiments may not be those enjoyed in the People's Republic of Massachusetts or elsewhere. If you look to the very ambiguity of the notion of culture, one recognizes that it, out of color, first is that of a planter. Of course, my family were ranchers. We had no sympathy for farmers at all, coming from a lower and distant culture. But culture, for example, encompasses both planter and laborer and worshiper. And so I will pull on those ambiguities. For a cultus, a cult, in the Latin identifies not just worship, but also dress. You can see I have boots on and I have a belt buckle. I have the cultus of a Texan. It also picks out training. It picks out occupation. One talks about the life world of a physician and the ways in which physicians live, which is quite different from the life world and expectations of philosophers. And since I live a sort of amphibious life between a medical school and a department of philosophy, I can pick out those different cultures. I am not talking about culture simply as the compartmentalization of behavioral norms, but really different ways of looking at the world. Now, many of us may not really experience that unless we live as an outsider. One can be a marginal man, an outsider as a Texan, as one comes north. I will not tell you the stories that would illuminate that. My spiritual father would not allow me. it would only tempt you into sin, because if you saw the joy of it, it's all sin. And Texas is surely a place for sinners, but Christ came, after all, not for the just, but for the sinners. Read Texans. But if you think about the kind of contrast that one experiences if one lives in a thick culture, that's what I'm going to try to invite us to think about today. One experiences that contrast if one lives as an Orthodox Jew in a world that's radically different. One experiences that contrast as well if one lives as a devout Christian in a world that's radically different. And so as I talk about the culture of death, I'll be talking about a world in which abortion is taken for granted. Euthanasia is not seen as that problematic. And I speak from the culture, or one of the cultures I live in, that of medicine, where it's very, very difficult for people in the Department of Obstetrics and Gynecology to even know why you would be worried about prenatal diagnosis and abortion, and where increasingly it's difficult for residents to understand why you would even be worried about physician-assisted suicide and euthanasia. So I'll be talking about an emerging culture of death and contrasting it with a Christian culture, in particular the Christian culture against which this culture of death developed. Now, when I talk in that way, it makes the rest of the culture that which isn't the culture of death, and it is that of which the culture of death, in a sense, developed. And I will be making an argument that will probably, for many, if not almost all, seem exotic and perhaps wrong-directed, that the very roots of the culture of death don't turn simply on getting it wrong about the value or the status of the unborn, but having forgotten that a culture to flourish well must be a culture of worship. And there we'll be making an argument about the centrality of worship, far beyond the arguments made by Catherine Pickstock, for example, in her recent book on the consummation of philosophy in the liturgical discourse of the Roman Mass. And I'll be doing that beyond training in virtue, but that worship itself opens the heart, and it opens its heart to those things that would allow us to understand that the culture of death is indeed the culture of death, not the culture of life and true liberation as we postmoderns are usually instructed to regard it. So along the way, I will be arguing that one of the things that helped us to a culture of death was the moralization of religion. That is, the seeing of religion primarily as doing the good and being just. As you'll see in this, one of the betoirs will be Immanuel Kant, and my argument will be that religion is really approaching holiness through worship, and only then will you get things right. You'll never learn how to love other people unless you love from that perspective, and so that the centrality of worship is the place where the culture of life, and only there, that the culture of life can be appreciated. All of this is preface. And David Solomon said, don't talk so long about the preface, you'll never get to the paper. In order to make things go quicker, it's a 30-page paper, 23 pages of text, and 7 pages of footnotes. When I think a footnote should be read, I'll go like this, and Father Poorman will read it. It won't be that bad. I will now try to bring you into my reflections about the culture of life and death. The third millennium opens as a post-Christian, post-modern, post-metaphysical, post-traditional age. The ubiquity of the prefix post signals the radical changes that mark our times. We've experienced a rupture, a fundamental change in our dominant self-understanding. We are first and foremost after Christendom. Our emerging global culture is set over against the various traditional cultures that are now past or passing. In particular, our emerging global culture, a child of Western imperialism, Western technological and scientific success, and Western worldwide economic dominance. Realize as a Texan you can describe all of that and it's positive. Is self-consciously set over against the Western Christian past. The culture of death we confront is integral to the new culture that is taking shape. This new culture does not see itself as a culture of death, but as a culture of life and liberation. Each culture is to the other a counterculture, marking a profound break in our history, our self-understanding, and our appreciation of life and death. In this presentation, I will address the culture of death by examining it in terms of the larger issue of the post-Christian culture within which we find ourselves. I will first indicate the radical character of the cultural transformation that has framed our current age. Then I will explore this new culture's tie to the contemporary affirmation of autonomy and liberation, as well as its marginalization of the culture of worship. These phenomena, I will show, are allied with the moralization of religion, which leads to the culture of death in the affirmation of abortion, as well as physician-assisted suicide and euthanasia. Christianity is no longer the established source of our culture. Despite the loss of the modern philosophical hope to secure a rational grounding for morality and metaphysics, elements of the Enlightenment prevail regarding religion and the secularization of the public space. Liturgical Christianity has been displaced from the public forum, and Christianity's metaphysical foundations for meaning and history have been cleared away. Unlike even some mere 3 centuries ago, ours is no longer a culture of worship, but one of secular morality and secular justice. The Christian message in the public forum seeks expression in the lingua franca of the principles of ethics and justice. Most significantly, liturgical life has been replaced with a private space, and the moral discourse of the public forum has been rendered thoroughgoingly secular. The discursive metaphysical search for transcendent grounding has been marginalized, if not abandoned. It is in this context that the traditional social structures and moral assumptions of the West regarding abortion and euthanasia have been brought into question. We no longer live in a culture that directs history from creation, the fall and redemption, to the second coming and the final judgment. As a consequence of this metaphysical and historical loss of orientation, we do not possess a univocal sense of human destiny. In the wake of this loss, we have the possibility of alternative histories and of competing moral narratives, along with the emerging specter of nihilism. We have witnessed through the Enlightenment, we have passed through the Enlightenment in the light of its liberation and its freeing us from ecclesiastical control and direction. We have experienced the marginalization of the culture of worship and the loss of a history rooted in human redemption. They have gone, all of this has gone away, largely unnoticed. Crucially, there is little suspicion that praying well is essential to morally knowing well. Morality is now to stand on its own without being located within a prayerful turn towards God. This post-Enlightenment culture, this culture of liberation from the dead hand of the past, and its Christian metaphysical history offers its own cultures of life and death, contrary to traditional Christian culture and its understanding of true culture of life and death. On the one hand, our emerging global culture affirms life sustained and technologically supported health and well-being. The new biomedical technologies have given us a greater assurance of a life of some 70 to 80 years in good health. Yet, central to this enlightened and technologically mediated way of life is the willful taking of unborn life and the emerging acceptance of planned, direct killing at the end of life. The culture of death, this culture of death, is integral to a new culture of liberation, which sets all free to pursue their own narratives of sexuality, reproduction, suffering, dying, and death, as long as the content of such narratives affirms autonomy and mutual respect. The very character of these changes and the appropriate responses, if any, are themselves controversial. For traditional Christians, these changes can be nothing but foreboding. After all, the traditional Christian focus is on liberation through submission to God. For some others, these changes mark the vanguard of human development and self-liberation from arbitrary authority and superstition. In any event, the times are different. The eschatology of Christianity no longer shapes our cultures. structures our history, or directs the lives of most in our societies, most no longer live as if they expected to be judged or the world judged at the second coming. This shift in eschatological orientation has also been tied to moral changes, including the new morality of abortion. As John Paul II laments in Veritatis Splendor, de-Christianity, which weighs heavily upon entire peoples and communities once rich in faith and Christian life, involves not only the loss of faith, or in any event, its becoming irrelevant for everyday life, but also of necessity a decline or obscuring of the moral sense. Our moral assumptions have changed. Our age has also, in the process, become post-philosophical, in the sense that metaphysics has largely been displaced by the scientific exploration of the immanent in response to Kant's three questions. What can I know? What ought I do? What may I hope? Our culture refers the first question, what can I know, for the most part to science, and the second question, what ought I to do, in great measure to individual choice, as Alistair underscored this morning, while dismissing the third, what may I hope, as an issue not to be engaged within the public forum unless it can be posed in immanent, non-religious terms. As a culture, we no longer expect philosophers, as in the Middle Ages, to help us find our way to the transcendent, nor do philosophers generally accept this metaphysical task to be their calling. Ours is an age that is not only after Christendom, but also beyond metaphysics. As the Italian philosopher Gianni Vattimo recognizes, in a post-Christian age, in an age after God, the old values no longer hold, and I quote, the death of God, which is at once the culmination and the conclusion of metaphysics, is also the crisis of humanism. Once orientation to and grounding in God are lost, metaphysics and morality are transformed. It is on this account, that is on account of this collapse of metaphysics, that in Fides et Ratio, John Paul II pleads for philosophers to have, quote, the courage to recover the range of authentic wisdom and truth, metaphysical truth included, which is proper to philosophical inquiry. John Paul II recognizes this major religious and philosophical change in our culture. He rightly diagnoses our movement from a Christianity to a post-Christian age. He laments our transformation from a metaphysical to a post-metaphysical age. People who were once Christian no longer live explicitly Christian lives. Many who are Christians now embrace abortion and even physician-assisted suicide. Philosophers who once puzzled about the deep questions of metaphysics are now satisfied to analyze the practices that sustain an immanent human culture. In all of this, there has been, as John Paul II recognizes, an emergence of a culture of death in the sense that the killing of humans has become a part of our ordinary cultural expectations. Again, I mean here to identify the acceptance of abortion as well as the growing acceptance of physician-assisted suicide and euthanasia. In addressing the culture of death, I will explore two intertwined matters, which I hold a key to understanding the emergence of the culture of death. The first is the move from a liturgical to a post-liturgical culture. By this, I mean, in part, the secularization of a once Christian culture, a culture that in past times celebrated its prayers in public spaces and thickly sanctified its life by an intense rhythm of prayer, fasting, and almsgiving. My analysis is not necessarily a plea for the reestablishment of Christendom. Rather, and most crucially, it is a recognition that there is an epistemic bond between moral knowledge and the spiritual life. Believing and worshiping rightly bring moral knowledge and moral discernment. In this brief presentation, this claim will be explored, though not defended. This view finds adequate presentation and defense elsewhere in the works of St. Isaac the Syrian, St. Simeon the New Theologian, and St. Gregory Palamas. Moral knowledge grows through a rightly ordered spiritual and liturgical life. Unlike the different, albeit important point and claim of Catherine Pickstock regarding the liturgical consummation of philosophy, the claim here is one concerning the spiritual nurturing of the human heart as a moral and noetic faculty. A second and related matter concerns the moralization of religion, by which I mean the post-Enlightenment understanding that the core truth of religion is to be found in a just and moral life. The evidence to the contrary notwithstanding, few are inclined in the wake of the Enlightenment dispositions regarding religion to recognize that the moral life, once disengaged from a culture of worship, loses its grasp on the moral premises that foreclose the culture of death. The culture of death develops naturally from the moralization of religion, the view that the focus and meaning of religion are in morality, because morality as a secular morality cannot appreciate the moral premises needed to understand the evil of the culture of death. By default, secular morality is driven to acknowledging as central the permission of actual moral agents, thus rendering abortion and physician-assisted suicide, along with euthanasia, licit. I will close by indicating that the solution to the moral decrepitude of our culture lies in philosophy as an ascetic, noetic term, not as a discursive intellectual endeavor. Ours is a culture of death. To put the matter bluntly, premeditated killing is an accepted element of secular moral life. It is integral to contemporary, taken-for-granted secular moral responsibilities. This is nowhere more salient than at the beginning of life. Abortion supports the self-liberation of persons from the tyranny of their biology. It is not just that abortion is the remedy for contraceptive failures, thus securing enhanced financial expectations and the ease of a wide range of heterosexual lifestyles. It is only by the availability of abortion that one can guarantee that career plans will not be encumbered by reproduction at an inconvenient time, or financial plans disturbed by the unexpected need to raise a child. In addition, prenatal diagnosis and selective abortion are now integral to responsible parenting. Responsible secular parents are those who, with the aid of responsible healthcare professionals, take measures to ensure that the children they do bring into the world are healthy and wanted, even if this involves infanticide, as in the case of partial birth abortion. To act otherwise would be to limit the autonomy of others or to impose a particular moral narrative of reproduction and suffering. Within this ethos of liberty, parents perceive secular moral obligations not to burden society, themselves, or their future children with handicaps and disabilities. More fundamentally, abortion is now integral to humanity's liberation from the blind forces of biology that encumber the free choice and life projects of humans. In particular, abortion supports the liberation of women from the biological necessities of reproduction that can always threaten an active sexual life and that it will conflict with vocation outside of the home. Contemporary secular moral understandings of heterosexual intimacy, career plans, and responsible reproduction presuppose the easy availability of abortion to terminate unwanted or inconvenient pregnancies. The non-availability of abortion comes then to be recognized as an act of social violence against women and against humans generally in forced pregnancy, as the non-availability of abortion paradigmatically supports pre-modern patriarchal structures and biological dominance. In this light, the killing involved in abortion can be accepted as essential to the revolution of enlightened persons against the oppression of traditional social structures and absurd biological constraints. This revolution and its liberation, of which abortion is a part, marks the ethos of our contemporary age and is integral to its appreciation of abortion. The web of contemporary moral obligations to responsible liberation from the past and from biology on behalf of personal freedom is sustained by recognizing a decisive moral difference between human biological life and human personal life, which difference is then set at birth, allowing one then to move to make this choice. There is emerging also a secular ethos that at the close of life affirms self-killing, physician-assisted suicide, and the direct killing of patients by physicians as ways of respecting the autonomy of dying persons and their interest in a death with dignity. Again, there is a theme of liberation from absurd biological necessity, so that the good death is associated with a death freely chosen through one's own actions or the invited interventions of others. Because permission is the linchpin of secular morality, there is no longer a hesitation to act intentionally to facilitate death, given the consent of the persons who want to die. At the end of life, there is no dispute that persons are killing persons. The justification for such killing is found in persons waiving the right not to be killed, and indeed in invoking the right to self-killing with the assistance of others, especially when one's final days would otherwise be marked by suffering and the indignities of biological constraints unacceptable to the patients. Justification for physician-assisted suicide and euthanasia thus are derived from the autonomy of persons as well as from concerns with the so-called death with dignity. The secular philosophical attitude is then restored to Seneca's commitment to living well rather than as long as possible. At the beginning and end of life, killing is becoming a taken-for-granted element of our emerging secular culture of liberation from biology and social tyranny. These central roles for human killing in our culture provoke a warrant for the term the culture of death. In contrast to the commitments of traditional Christianity, killing is now an element of the accepted ethos and established secular bioethics of our culture. Yet the phrase culture of death is also misguiding. If anything, our culture fails to take death seriously, but a word about that in a moment. I mean, one of the risks to a speaker who's a postprandial speaker is that people will go to sleep. And so now I will, contrary to the injunctions of David Solomon, remind you about two liberal cultures, one California and the other the Republic of Texas. Those who are not physicians may not attend to, for example, to tort for wrongful life suits. Those are suits under which children who have not been aborted can sue you for the handicaps they possess. An interesting suit was in Illinois. Being a Texan, I will not comment about the morals of Illinois, but in the 50s, a man, Zepeda, sued his father for having been born a bastard in Illinois, unlike Texas, where it's qualification for higher office. The court recognized that he had suffered a harm, but held that there would be no remedy to make him whole. People, though, continued to press this, and in the early 70s and in the 80s, it became quite clear that parents could sue physicians if they'd not been given the information that most people would like to abort a child of this sort, and should the child be born with handicaps, the physician should make the parents whole. The interesting development in the late 70s and early 80s was also actions brought on behalf of the child for having not been aborted. One of the most interesting was the Kurlander versus Bioscience Laboratory, where the Kurlanders went to be tested to see if they were carrying Tay-Sachs. And as you can tell, they got the results inaccurately from Bioscience Laboratory, since their name is appended in this case. And the court held that truly Bioscience Laboratory was culpable, because had they given the right results, the child would have been aborted, and now the parents were faced with taking care of a child with Tay-Sachs disease for 3 to 5 years before the child died. But they also point out that the child could sue as well for its damages, and interestingly argue that should it want to, it should be able to sue its parents for not having aborted it. Now, that was, in the end, too much even for California. That was reversed in a case called Turpin, and many states made it so that parents couldn't be sued by their children. But on most states in the United States, a child can sue for the handicaps that it has, which could have all have been avoided had one only aborted the child. That is, the whole idea of acting responsibly as a good physician and as a good parent, or a good parent to be. I mean, I'm a grandfather now three children, two of whom are ex utero, and my daughters have all been told, though they said they had no interest in it, they have to listen to as I tell you, you may want to test and have this child aborted. So part of what it is to be responsible, that is to free yourself from the constraints of biology, is to make choices, that is, those who are moral agents, and moral agents are only those who can argue with you, and if you don't do that, you will suffer the costs that come to moral agents who come into the world carrying those handicaps. That was my story about California, to wake you up. The other one is about Texas. My country is a godless country, as I said. Christ came for sinners, not for the righteous. And when we had the founding of our country in 1836, we asked ourselves, what's wrong with a good killing? It's still a very hard question for even me. My spiritual father keeps working on me. And since I've become Orthodox, I haven't killed anybody at all. But when the Texans asked that of themselves, they couldn't answer the question. I mean, it's hard. So they asked, what's the difference between free love and rape? Consent. What's the difference between a gift and theft? Consent. What's the difference between good, honest killing and murder? Consent. So initially there was no dueling in Texas, and until the illegal immigration from the north, there was no law against aiding and abetting suicide in Texas. You could have gone up to anyone and said, it's a matter of theological debate, which is worse, Oklahoma or hell, and I'm offering you a double-barrel 12-gauge shotgun, and if you can find your brains, small as they are, blow them away, we'll all be grateful. The view was volenti non fit injuria, if you consent. How could you in a liberal society, or a libertarian society in sensu stricto, which was Texas, have a ground against it? If anything, our culture fails to take death seriously. Indeed, our culture cannot appreciate the seriousness of death, since it no longer recognizes that death is the door to the dread judgment seat of Jesus Christ. This particularistic, metaphysical, and personal truth defines the true meaning of death. It gives death its eternal significance. This particularistic truth is at odds with the universal aspirations of a secular, post-Christian, cosmopolitan culture and its discourse, in which it is now unacceptable to speak in such terms in the public forum. Yet, if this very particular truth is not acknowledged, then one will not be able adequately to recognize the significance of death or prepare properly for one's dying. It is only in terms of this ultimate truth that one can adequately appreciate the evils of abortion and of physician-assisted suicide. The cultural challenge is then, how can this religious truth be voiced in a public forum grown normatively secular, normatively post-Christian, and liberal cosmopolitan? Publicly to recognize that the meaning of all life and death is to be found fully only in terms of the life, death, and resurrection of the Messiah and Son of God, Jesus Christ, is to introduce into the public forum and its discussions of death a most particular and divisive religious, moral, and metaphysical truth. It is, in a secular context, the particularism of this claim will often be experienced as driving a wedge between those who are traditional Christians and those who are non-Christian or post-Christian. How can one voice such a religiously disruptive as well as non-ecumenical truth? Once the public forum is secularized and rendered cosmopolitan, the unutterability of this truth marks the hegemony of the secular age and the foundations of the culture of death. One is, in general, expected to be politely silent concerning the sectarian truths on which the very meaning of life and death turn, leaving the field by default to the metaphysical vacuity of the liberal cosmopolitan. Our reflections on morality, liberation, and justice occur in a secular space, supposedly definable outside of any ingression of religious truth. To regard the culture of life in terms of the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ is to appreciate that culture in terms that transcend both discursive rationality and the framework of the secular public space. St. Paul appreciates this very well. After speaking of the centrality of the cross, he asked, where is the wise? Where is the scribe? Where is the disputer of this age? Did not God make foolish the wisdom of this world? For since in the wisdom of God the world knew not God through its wisdom, it pleased God through the foolishness of the preaching to save those who believe. That's a bashing of philosophers, if you didn't notice. For closer attention to the meaning of the text, see St. John Chrysostom. The true culture of life, St. Paul well understands, can be appreciated only by reference to Christ's death and the Christian's death to the world, which can only be understood in the grace of a culture of right worship, as, to quote again from Paul, the communion of his Son, Jesus Christ our Lord. To locate the culture of life in terms of the culture of worship is to place matters in a context that goes deeply against the grain of our age. Another way to appreciate our current context and the centrality of the culture of death is to recognize how radically other to Christianity the West has become within the last 3 centuries. The West has stepped away, at times in bloody fashions, from its traditional Christian past. The West was once an instance of Christendom in the sense that Christianity was established at law and framed the expectations of the dominant culture. The 20th century witnessed the completion of the disestablishment of Christianity that began with the French Revolution, which was directed not just against the throne, but also against altars. To take just one instance of the magnitude of these changes, on the eve of the French Revolution, there were 1,000 Benedictine monasteries for men and 1,500 convents for women. Only 5% remained half a century later. This marginalization of religious social presence was in part a direct result of the French Revolution. Other changes came independently, as with the Josephism of the Austrian Kaiser and Holy Roman Emperor Joseph II, who closed nearly 700 religious houses in the Austro-Hungarian Empire. As significant as these was the secularization that followed the extraordinary Reichsdeputation assembled on the 24th of August 1802, so that German sovereigns who had lost territory to the French west of the Rhine could receive compensation. Amongst those people, by the way, were the ancestors of Lord Acton. For those who are Lord Acton fans, they should know the sins of his blood. But far be it for me to go into that. The Reichsdeputationshauptschluss transformed the social and moral character of Central Europe. It not only dissolved the remaining episcopal principalities and initiated a Bildersturz, or iconoclasm of monasteries, libraries, and ecclesiastical art. Most significantly, it destroyed a thick web of Roman Catholic charitable and educational institutions, which had sustained Christian welfare and education since the Middle Ages. Christianity was no longer central to the care of the poor, which task became increasingly a function of the state. The Silesian poet Eichendorff has a wonderful book he wrote about the changes. To this secularizing social transformation must be added the many other secular, legal, and social restructurings achieved through the force of Napoleon's total war against the feudal Christian past on behalf of liberation and universal human rights. The drama on December the 2nd, 1804, of Napoleon crowning himself in the presence of Pius VII underscored the cultural watershed in Western European history, marked by the French Revolution and Napoleonic policies. The public fora became post-feudal, post-Christian, and robustly secular. Almost unnoticed, but of no less, at least symbolic importance, was the passing of the millennial Western Christian Empire on the 6th of August, 1806, the Feast of the Transfiguration. A new secular understanding of culture, which would frame the culture of death, was now developing. There was a shift from a next-worldly understanding of life to a this-worldly experience of human existence. Western civilization moved its official focus from the transcendent to the immanent. Its once officially religious character was fundamentally deconstructed, or at least reconstructed. During the latter part of the 20th century, this secularization led to various legal changes which would put other religions on a par with the previously established Christian religions, and which secularized the public forum so as to obscure its previously Christian character. One might think in particular of how the United States, which had a de facto and indeed often de jure establishment of Christianity, read Protestant Christianity, until the first half of the 20th century, saw its law and public policy take on a robustly secular character beginning in the 1950s. A century and 3/4 after its founding, America came to exercise Christian prayers from public schools and Christian symbols from public places. Notice that's American history. You go back to Texas, we were godless from the very beginning. There was a study done in 1846, which is the year of the Anschluss between Texas and the Americans, and only 1 out of every 8 Texans had ever gone into either a synagogue or church. The others had been to many bars, but that's the only grace they had ever sought. This disestablishment of Christianity was accompanied by a change in the established piety of Christians and the lifestyles sustained by the particular Christian faiths. As Christendom dissolved, the taken-for-granted lifestyles of Christians also fell into desuetude. There was a de-sanctification of ordinary life. The robust rhythms of fasts and festivals that once governed the diets as well as the times for marriage and sexual congress were dramatically attenuated. Patterns of eating, sexuality, and almsgiving, which had once been orchestrated by the fasts and festivals of a self-confidently Christian worldview, were relocated within the experience and expectations of the secular world. Christian charity was overshadowed by the role of the welfare state. Those who approached the issue of moral deportment did so ever less embodied with an all-encompassing traditional Christian life. It is not simply that many of the established institutions of Christendom were set aside by force of law, nor is it just that Christianity was disestablished and Christendom replaced by a secular polity. Nor is it only that Christian culture was marginalized by the hegemony of the secular culture. Most significantly, Western Christian culture muted, dampened, and transformed itself. Western Christianity made itself less intrusive in the lives of both Christians and non-Christians. The response of Christendom to its disestablishment and secularization has not been that of Nineveh to the reproach of Jonah, namely, to enter into a great and severe fast so as to change their hearts and receive God's mercy. One might think of the mid-19th century lament of the Benedictines at their Congress in Vienna, in which they seemed to acknowledge that, as they became less Benedictines and a less Christian culture, Christians were striving less ascetically to live the life of traditional Christians. I quote, "Through dispensations that have been granted liberally, the severity of the ancient fasts have been so mitigated in our day that little remains of the love-inspired violence done to the body." I close the quote. Christianity's response to Christianity's greater irrelevance in the ordinary conduct of life and the increasingly secular polities of the West has not been to call Christians to a more intense Christian life. In fact, the response has generally been quite the opposite. Rather than to return to the ancient fasts or to sanctify time and social behavior by prayers and vigils in order to gain spiritual strength or to require more exacting almsgiving so as to strengthen brotherly love, better philosophical arguments have been sought in order to re-educate a culture gone morally and metaphysically wrong. The challenge to faith and culture has appeared to be more one of moral and metaphysical education than one of spiritual development. From the time of the Syllabus of Errors to Vatican II, as the persuasive and pervasive influence of the surrounding secular society grew, the reaction has not been to strengthen Christian culture by recalling it to a renewed and vigorous asceticism. The prime focus has not been on the pursuit of holiness. Instead, the focus has been on the substance of intellectual and moral reorientation rather than on spiritually nurturing the knower. There has been little appreciation of the moral epistemological truth that to know well morally, one must pray well and rightly. In shifting the ground of concern from maintaining a holy culture to securing a just culture, Christianity relocated itself within the playing field defined by the Enlightenment and by its new secular culture, which would, in the end, sustain the culture of death. The strategy of foregoing the rigors of traditional asceticism, cloaking Christian particularities, and desanctifying time so as to shed idiosyncrasies and to focus on morality and social justice, has a strong claim on plausibility, given the Enlightenment view that the truth of religion is to be found in doing the good, not in pursuing holiness. After all, this side of the Enlightenment, the nature of the good and the claims of social justice should be rationally demonstrable and therefore expressible in the language of rationality, the lingua franca of the public forum. Moreover, after the Enlightenment, there is no recognition that the religious life also transforms the knower. For if recognizing the evil of abortion and physician-assisted suicide requires a heart open to God by right worship, then the culture of death will appear as if it were the culture of life and liberation. In the shadow of the Enlightenment, a properly philosophical Christianity, as the protector of social justice and morality, can enter into the secular public forum almost unnoticed and defend its message in discursive, rational terms, even if religious claims are excluded from this context. But the price for such an entrance is disassociation from the moral epistemic standpoint within which the culture of death can be recognized as such. Christianity is primarily achieving social justice and realizing political liberation, finds its roots in the momentous change wrought by the Enlightenment, which desanctified time, replaced charity with welfare, and further forged the tie between morality and rationality. Out of its aspiration to universalism and its reaction against sectarianism, the Enlightenment sought to understand the moral life outside of the particularities of religious commitment. It effected a secular displacement of the theological and a thoroughgoing immanization of the transcendent, as Kant forcefully argues. The truth of religion is to be found in the moral life that religion can encourage. The life of faith is not recognized as freeing the knower to see morality truly. Instead, religion, when freed from superstition, is regarded as providing a special impetus to live morally. Once religion is defined in terms of the good and reason presumed able to define the good, then religious discussions in the public forum can be conducted within the confines of secular moral discourse by being transformed into moral discussions. So as not to invoke divisive sectarian commitments, religion is moralized so that one can point to the good known by reason and find the value of religious beliefs in its moral force and its support of social justice. Immanuel Kant provides a paradigm example of this Enlightenment commitment to the moralization of religion and its liberation from ecclesiastical strictures. He anchors religion in its moral force. The truth of religion is to be found in the moral life it inspires, not in the pursuit of the transcendent. Moreover, for Kant, religion is not to be found in a historical account of a savior or in a particular ecclesiastical structure. To quote from Kant's Religion innerhalb der bloßen Vernunft, the sacred narrative, which is employed solely on behalf of ecclesiastical faith, can have, and taken by itself, ought to have absolutely no influence upon the adoption of moral maxims. And since it is given to ecclesiastical faith only for the vivid presentation of its true object, virtue striving towards holiness, which means effortlessly keeping the categorical imperative, it follows that this narrative must at all times be taught and expounded in the interest of morality. Close quote. Biblical Christianity is to be subjected to a moral reconstruction so that religious life can be construed in terms of the morality that faith endorses. Kant affirms a moral recasting of religious concerns in favor of the ethical. He effects a further transformation of his religious faith, placing it fully within the aspirations of the Enlightenment. Religion as the pursuit of holiness, understood apart from perfect and unhindered conformity to the moral law, is rejected, especially if religion is understood as the pursuit of communion with God. Kant repudiates this latter view of religion in no uncertain terms, and I quote again from Kant, striving for what is supposed to be communion with God is religious fanaticism, the fanatical religious illusion. is the moral death of reason. Without reason, after all, no religion is possible, since, like all morality in general, it must be established upon basic principles, close quote. In full accord with the Enlightenment and in anticipation of Napoleon's secularization, Kant is a self-conscious critic of the traditional pieties of Christianity. He speaks with revulsion concerning, quote, the mystical fanaticism in the lives of hermits and monks and the glorification of the holiness of celibacy, which rendered great masses of people useless to the world, close quote. The usefulness of religion is to be found in its moral force. Kant gives ground for the now widely accepted religious maxim that it doesn't matter what one believes or what religion one practices as long as one lives a good moral life. Morality, the pursuit of the good, and social justice come to be the cash value of the religious life. The culture of worship is thus transformed into the culture of morality and justice. Kant, following Hume, rejects the superstitious belief of divine worship, and in the process, holiness is recast in terms of effortless conformity to the moral law, the categorical imperative. The bequest to our future culture is the understanding of the religious life, now couched in moral terms, able to be articulated without difficulty in the context of a secular society. Religion is reconstructed beyond the particularities of religious faith and is found instead in the universality of morality and social justice. Here, however, is where the crucial and foundational difficulties lie for secular morality. One must choose a content for the universal morality and justice one wishes to pursue. The question then becomes, as John Paul II recognizes in our secular culture, which content to choose. From nowhere, no particular content can be established. All choices of content require a particular moral perspective. From the perspective of a particular somewhere, the content chosen will be contingent. It will be one amongst the possible other choices that could have been made. Given this difficulty, permission becomes the central key of moral reflection, and in this circumstance invites a valuing of autonomous choice itself. The permission of persons will not merely be a source of moral authority, but itself a value. In the pursuit of universal morality, one then comes to the foundations of the liberal cosmopolitan morality of liberation, life, abortion, and euthanasia. Liberation from the constraint, especially of the dead hands of the past, and an affirmation of individual narratives of autonomy. Moralizing of religion in order to make religion universally acceptable as a language of morality and justice leads to the loss of the content that could have made plain the evil of the culture of death and thus the nature of a culture of life. Good news, there are only 2 paragraphs left. You'll probably survive to the end. No promises. In the light of these considerations, how should we then understand the conflict between the culture of life and the culture of death? As with all serious questions, matters are more complicated than will appear at first blush. On the one hand, the culture of death will understand itself as in truth the culture of liberation and of life, as a culture of freedom from the certain constraints of biology and from the oppressive social structures that these biological constraints sustain, and from the dead hand of superstition and the past. On the other hand, the culture of life, the true culture of life, will focus on death, seeing all true life in the death and resurrection of Christ. This affirmation will involve dying to the world, at least as the secular cosmopolitan world understands this world. This death to the world, which is at the heart of Christian asceticism and its appreciation of true life, is a sustaining context for any philosophical reflection that will not lead to the equivalent of Plato's politeia, of which St. John Chrysostom is so critical. One will find the culture of life where the culture of death to the world flourishes. A Christianity without a vibrant asceticism and a vigorous sanctification of time will be lost in the passions of the liberal cosmopolitan world, which sustains the culture of death. A philosophy of life that does not live in the spirit of monks such as St. Basil the Great, St. John Chrysostom, and St. Isaac of Syria will have lost its authentic Christian voice and will have become integrated within the culture of death. It is not simply that a Christian culture disarticulated from a culture of worship cannot rightly understand a culture of life through lacking a crucial point of orientation or a needed source of moral discipline. More fundamentally, its members will lack the moral capacity adequately to see and experience what is crucially at stake in living the good human life and pursuing true liberation, namely right worship of God and freedom from one's passions. It is not just that the sensibilities, morality, and culture of our age are not defined by Christianity, nor by a canonical account of modernity, leaving us to the temptations of a culture of death. More fundamentally, outside of right worship, we will lack a capacity. We will lack the freedom of the intellect, of which St. Simeon Metaphrastes writes in his paraphrase of the homilies of St. Macarius of Egypt. We will be restrained by that veil across our intellect, drawn by the fall, and which only grace can set aside. Thank you so very much.
Rob Miner of Boston College Philosophy Department, and class of 93, Rice University. I did not take one of your courses, and I've been kicking myself ever since. I was intrigued by the way in which you spoke of a new secularization of culture and a new moralization of religion, and I think you quite appropriately mentioned Kant in this connection. I guess I'm just wondering about how new this really is. In the Euthyphro, both Socrates and Euthyphro agree that the pious is only a part of the just, that there are many things that could be just but which have no essential relation to the pious and might even be antithetical to piety. So I just want you to maybe flesh out your narrative by commenting more on the relationship between antique philosophy and modern secularity. And I was also intrigued by the way in which you mentioned the work of Catherine Pickstock. I can see some definite affinities between your emphasis on Christian singularity and your critique of liberalism with the work of Pickstock and her teacher, John Milbank. So if you want to comment on the relation between your grand narrative and theirs, I think that I would also be interested in that.
Thank you for a triad of very interesting questions. To begin with, I was threatened with bodily damage by David Solomon if I read the whole paper. And so there were 3 pages where I point out that the sense of the religious view that is disestablished was established. It was an establishment that occurs with St. Constantine in 321 when he establishes Sunday and establishes a Christian framework. Surely there was a paleo-pagan and a robust secular understanding of culture, and if one reads Versailles, that developed in Athens due to us physicians and due to the sophists. Read lawyers. So if you look at the ancient world, it had a concept, it had a secularity. Versailles is right, that developed out of the influence of us physicians and the lawyers, and that was robustly there. St. Constantine sets that aside, and the Christendom is established. What I was talking about is the disestablishment of that, leading to a contrast between the culture that had been in place and the new culture that develops. If one is interested in the history of thoughts, new is a relative thing. That's why I said brand new, just the last 300 years. But it takes us a while to attend to things. So that's the answer to the first question. Obviously, the way that I put it is not that justice is only a part, piety is only a part of justice, but that you'd have to understand justice is only a part of piety. And once you understand that justice is a part of piety, you'd get, if you were a Christian, much less interested in justice. I mean, as St. Isaac the Syrian says, if God has any justice, those are like little grains of sand before mountains of mercy. And show me a man who talks of justice and not of mercy, and I will show you a man who lives in a straw hut with a burning open fire. So obviously I, from my Hegelian past, have taken the fun of seeing the truth that you have to turn Plato's account of Socrates, which Don Morrison tells me is false anyway, because only Xenophon's account is correct. But I won't go into that, though you've tempted me. Christine Pickstock's work I esteem very highly, but I'm rooted in quite a different point of departure. I'm a convert to orthodoxy.
Philip Devine, Providence College. You've presented, Professor Engelhardt, what I denominate an all-or-nothing argument. As far as I can tell, if you are not Eastern Orthodox, by your argument, you cannot intelligibly oppose abortion. Now, as a matter of actual fact, it is not common, but then atheists are not common. There are atheists who oppose abortion. The best known case, unfortunately, stopped being an atheist, Dr. Bernard Natanson, but there are still atheists who oppose abortion.
Okay, very important question. Notice the peculiarity of my argument was that it focuses on a claim about moral epistemology. And that if you don't, in the end, believe and worship rightly, even the acts of love you do, which will be good, will be in crucial ways one-sided and incomplete. It doesn't mean you won't be able to do those in part. You should read to understand that is not to dismiss the good done by those who don't see fully, but to recognize there'll always be an incompleteness in it. Now, of course, you made my point by pointing out that Natanson went in the end to understand abortion from being an atheist to being a believer. And that's exactly what St. John Chrysostom would expect. That the more you worked at this and the more you tried to do the good, you'd finally understand that the truth is not a thing but a person. And that person would then come to your aid. No question. Thank you.
Thornton Lockwood from Boston College. Perhaps picking up in a similar vein, it seemed to me that you set in opposition Christendom in secular society with nothing between the two. And I'm wondering, how would you understand the projects of, say, Alexis de Tocqueville, Lord Acton, John Courtney Murray? Are these just failed popes, or is there anything within classical liberalism that Catholicism could seize upon to answer questions along the lines that you did?
That's a very rich question. Obviously, this is only a paper, and in a paper one sketches out what one takes to be the cardinal contrast. And the cardinal contrast I take to be between our culture now and what it once was. Even if you were an atheist, that would be of great interest to you, because it would explain to you how all of these strange Christian commitments exist in a culture now so radically different from the culture that once existed in the West. And so I played on that contrast. Now, there's no question there is a strong element that you will never quite get it all right until you know the truth completely. And that is the disruptive and unhappy and divisive character of traditional Christians. I mean, that's why the Romans hated them, because they were so politically incorrect to say, you know, you're nice people and all of that, and you have a wonderful empire, but until you really get to know the true God, you're really going to, in the end, do everything wrongly. Now, does that mean you can't find in classical liberalism things that you will be glad to have in favor rather than other undertakings? The answer is sure. Can you pick out less onerous evils? The answer is absolutely. Just because you understand that God is the most demanding person in the universe, it doesn't mean that you can't, while recognizing that and aiming towards Him, also recognize that you'll have to make all kinds of other choices, like, you know, what kind of boots to wear.
Thank you.
I'm Randy O'Bannon from the National Right to Life Educational Trust Fund. Even supposing that we have this revitalization of Christianism, Christian worship, and so forth, what basis then exists for any sort of engagement between that culture and the culture, the secular culture? Particularly, does that mean that all sort of political involvement and activity is of no value and at no point? Can you sort of talk about, we talked about the difference, talk about how that engagement works across that divide?
A very important question to which I'll only give a partial answer. You know, you're asking, how do we change the world?
Easy question.
How did the Christians change the world in the first 4 centuries, first 3 centuries? Did they write to their senators? Their senators were responsive people. Did they try to get their governors to be better governors? There's not much evidence of that. What they decided is if they became holy, the whole world would be changed. They understood that the kingdom of heaven is within you in such a radical fashion that every time I sin, I make your life worse. And any time I turn back just a little bit from my sins, I change the whole world. And if I could ever achieve holiness, that would have impact on thousands of people. They understood that there was nothing in the face of the earth more powerful than holiness. And they had that as their secret weapon. And so they recognized that, maybe you could, under certain circumstances, engage in political activity, and maybe that wouldn't distract you from the real endeavors you were about, and that might be good and fine. But they knew that they had the secret weapon. They could change the world through holiness. So if you want to change the world, find peace of your soul in union with God, and 10,000s of people around you will be saved.
Is it a choice between praying and
it's not usually a choice between praying and voting. If you find out that you are actually called to be a monk, it will be. Each of us, in our very great particularity, is different. And there is no law made for everyone. Or put it in almost Kafkaesque terms, the law is made for each person. Now you're asking a question of guidance, and I'm not a holy man, so I can't give you guidance. But if you find holy men and women, they will tell you, you'll have to see what you can bear at this point and try to step away from yourself towards holiness. And for a while, you might have to vote. I'm going to vote in Texas. My spiritual father lets me vote in Texas. He says I can vote more than 24 times in any election. That's down from the past. And he says that, you're working at it, this is a passion, but considering all the other passions you give into, this is not the one we'll work at once. And all of those votes will naturally be for George Bush, that carpetbagger.
William DeMars, Notre Dame. If our culture is post-Christian, post-metaphysics, etc., is it also post-humanist? And if you think so, when did it happen?
Gianni Vattimo has a nice joke. God is dead and man isn't doing that well either. Look, once you don't understand that the only reason you were created was to worship God, everything will go bad. You can't understand why humans are here. I mean, that's the remark that Nietzsche so perceptively says. After Copernicus, we no longer think the world is the center of everything, man is just going into an X. Well, what does he mean? Well, you ask anybody in biology, does evolution have a direction? No. Things happen. Humans happen. Roaches happen. Roaches happen for a long period of time. That's it. Someone says, there are higher animals? Higher animals. I mean, how can you be so prejudicial against the Amphioxus? Just different things happen. Humanism presupposed a cardinal understanding of what it is to be human. I mean, the very idea of the humanissimus vir. I mean, when Cicero writes to someone and says, humanissime vire, I got it evocative right? Ralph, humanissime vire? You use that V? Oh, I'm so sorry. He never learned to speak Latin as we Krauss from Central Texas understand. But when Cicero writes, most human sir, he has a really thick textured understanding of what it is to be human. Once you have multiple narratives and no narrative that is canonical, the whole idea of humanism is brought into question. You can't do it anymore. You have no canonical understanding, and that's why Gianni's joke, God is dead and man isn't doing too well, aptly sketches our...
Is that late 20th century or early 19th century or somewhere in between?
Well, I mean, and I think he's right. I mean, it's equivalent. Probably 1875 as Nietzsche begins really to publish and people begin to understand. Look at the end of the 19th century reflections. There's a sort of fervent nihilism that begins. to some extent, it really doesn't grip us until after the First World War. I mean, the First World War was a disaster. I mean, we'd become good secular progressives. There's going to be peace forever. I mean, how could you imagine, that the Straussian waltzes would ever stop? And that led to all of the slaughter field, beside the fact that you'd been so secularized and so nice and progressive. And the nihilism that comes after that fully frames it. So I don't know how you'd want to sketch someplace between 1875, when you look at Kurt Schwitters and the Dada portrait. Kurt Schwitters understands it completely, that there is no longer any canonical understanding of the human experience that you could, and all Dada poetry and painting and sort of events. I mean, Kurt Schwitters comes to give a poetry reading carrying a bunch of bones from a slaughterhouse. I mean, boy, did he understand what was coming.
Paul Sigmund from Princeton. The societies that you described, and from Constantine, Saint Constantine, down to the modern period, as holy societies, were based on a lot of things, but one of those important part of their foundation was coercion. And as John Locke and the Second Vatican Council recognized, there's actually a fundamental contradiction between coercion and faith. How can you build a holy society of the sort that you sketch out without coercion, other than in a monastery?
A wonderful question. First, I never use the term holy society. Secondly, I never suggested that we should build a holy society. Third, I never even suggested a holy society could this side of the Second Coming ever be established. And I did that full-wittingly. I talked about how you could have holy people. And holy people can have a holy community, even if they're not the dominant culture. What is the invitation here for Christians? It's to live like Orthodox Jews, to understand that you can indeed be a holy community, even if there is not a holy society or state. Now, if you do that, you will have a culture within which you will be able to perceive rightly the culture of life and the culture of death. But it was malice aforethought that I did not use those phrases. I think that's all that he will give me to the left here. Let me thank you for your patience and for the honor and pleasure of speaking with you today.